How's everybody going? Good? You guys all here to see some JavaScript? Yeah? So how many of you guys do Vue? Angular? React? Okay, so a lot more React. Got it. I actually do a lot of Angular. So a lot of these examples I might reference some Angular stuff. I don't know React and Vue near as well, and probably not near enough to do the parallels. So to you guys who don't know any Angular, I apologize. But that's how it goes. So I'm Martine, and today I'm going to talk to you guys about web components and specifically writing them without a framework. And the reason I kind of thought about this talk and put this talk together is because we'd just gone through and written all our stuff on Angular JS, and it was the cool new thing. And then React kind of came along, and then Angular came along, and then Vue came along, and we're like, well, we ended up moving everything to Angular. But realistically, I kind of started thinking I would do a lot of front end, mostly, pretty much only front end. And it was like, well, for the next wave, how would I get components to actually transfer over to whatever the next framework and whatever the next cool new thing is going to be? Because there's bound to be one, right? It's JavaScript. We blink and there's a new framework. There's bound to be something else coming down the pipe. And so how could I make it so that my components would stay true across any of those frameworks? Or say if a different team who prefers to use React or prefers to use Vue, how could they go ahead and make use of those components regardless of whatever framework they want to use? So I started digging. I'm like, well, all of these frameworks do components at some level. I should be able to do them in just JavaScript because browsers run JavaScript. It should be possible. And it actually is. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to look at a decent amount of code. So don't worry, at the very end, there is a repo out there on GitHub, and all of that good stuff, I'll give you guys the URLs so that you can check out the code for yourselves if you want to when we're done. So, but at the very core, web components, what are they? We talk about it a lot, and we know generally, like, we use them, but what are they? And what they are basically reusable custom elements that are encapsulated. And that's the real big thing about it. It's encapsulated, which means I can take that element and just plop it in anywhere, and it's not going to, unless I want it to, interact with what's around it. So it's not because my parent application has a set of styles, for example, that it's going to affect the styles inside of that component. I can encapsulate that and not make it move. So those customs elements that we build, there's a JavaScript API for them. Most of it uses the shadow DOM and allows us to define what those are going to be and then create whatever elements we want in them, whatever styles we want, whatever functionality we want, and go ahead and apply those. So we're going to look at how to do that. The last piece, obviously, is shadow DOM, which I mentioned a couple of times. We'll get in a little bit more about exactly what that means. I'll throw this graphic back up. But what it does is it allows inside of our DOM to create another DOM inside of it that is encapsulated and independent from the parent DOM. So there's a little bit of some fun interactions there, and allows us to control that the functionality inside of our component. So there's pieces, and so to create a custom component in vanilla JavaScript, there's kind of two pieces we can use. There's templates and slots. Templates are generally, we're not going to talk about those much today, but what those are is they allow us to, and I have those in the wrong order. What templates do is they allow you to take a piece, have it in your HTML somewhere. It won't display until you, using JavaScript, or basically tell it, I want to do X. So they're great for an element you might want to repeat repeatedly, but doesn't have a lot to go with it, and you're not going to be referencing a whole bunch maybe in one place. Think a list, or one-time use case for a list would be a good one for that. Slots is the other piece. Slots allow you to inject information into that component. And so that is, for those who know Angular, it's the equivalent of using ng content. But that allows us to, from the parent application, inject stuff into our component. And is one of the few ways that we can actually interact with our component because of the isolation. So that's a little bit of JavaScript review, because I know a lot of us play with a lot of frameworks. If you're in JavaScript, you may have used those a lot more often than maybe in Angular, but I know as an Angular dev, it'd been a really long time since I'd had to use any of these functions, so we're going to go over them really, really quick just to kind of refresh our memory, and then we'll get into how to actually use them to create our component. The first one is document create element. That's how we're going to actually create that custom component. And what that allows us to do is take a tag name and whatever, and then we can start forming our component with that. We have set attribute. We're going to use that in order to create our IDs. We're going to use that to add some classes, any kind of text attribute we might want to add. Accessibility-wise, if we want to add ARIA attributes, those sorts of things, that's the tag we're going to be able to use. Class list, that's how we're going to manipulate our CSS. I'm going to go and show kind of 2 ways to handle the CSS with our components. But add, toggle, remove, replace, keeping in mind that IE11 may bite you on this one. Most of what we're going to talk about today works in modern browsers. IE11 is not one of them. But if you're working with Edge, especially Edge Chrome, if you're working with the latest version of Chrome Firefox, it'll work just fine, perfectly fine in the wild. All of the examples that I'm going to show up are done in my normal Chrome, and I was even good. I didn't even take them in Safari and in Canary. I used the normal Chrome version. So it will work in Chrome without any kind of Babel or any kind of finicking with it. Append child, that's what we're going to use to kind of, once we have all our pieces inside of our component built, that's what we're going to use to help put it together and actually build that final element that's going to get displayed. So shadow DOM, that's kind of the root of what we're going to use to create that component. And so we have our normal DOM tree. We're used to using it. It's got our elements, and that's how we can, using our JavaScript, get element by ID to go do something, or get element by class, you know, and get our elements and pieces. And it's kind of the root of the document. What the shadow DOM does is inside that custom element, we're going to basically inject a second DOM tree, which is completely isolated, and that's where our component is going to live. Anything that happens inside of that shadow root is kind of like a black box. There's very, very few things we can do to interact with them. We can pass information in and out, but you're not going to be able to do a whole lot in terms of affecting what happens in that box once the element is created. So, in order to do this little demonstration, a friend of mine jokingly said you should bring back the blink tag, because we're all sad that the blink tag went away. Now, a lot of my other talks are about accessibility, so I feel the need to say I actually wrote an NPM package that brings back the blink tag and everything. Please don't use it. It's a joke. Please just don't. It's not even like minimized or anything. Like, it's not production worthy. It's just there to prove a point. Please don't. Last thing I need is my accessibility buddies going, what in the world are you doing to the world? So please don't. But that's what we're going to use as our example today. So essentially what we're going to do is we're going to create a component, and it's going to blink. And the code will blink more often than that. I limited the code to blinking 3 times, not too fast, so I don't make all of you seasick and don't, like, you know, distract everybody during the entire talk, because that would be obnoxious. So just know that if you're actually running the code that's there, it'll keep blinking ad nauseum and forever. So what are we going to do? There's 2 types of custom elements we can build. There's autonomous custom elements. That's what we're going to build today, which allows us to build a custom element from scratch to do whatever in the world we want it to do. The other ones is a customized built-in element, which means you're taking an HTML element that naturally exists inside the spec already. So your paragraph tag, your div tag, your button, pick your poison, and you're doing something to extend its functionality. We're just going to go ahead and build something from scratch, because obviously Blink doesn't exist anymore. It's not like we can go and try to do more stuff with it, because we can't get to it anymore, and it won't work in most modern browsers. So we're going to do an autonomous custom element. And so in order to do that, and all of this is in ES6 syntax, we're going to create a class, which basically extend an HTML element. None specifically, just HTML element. And at the very beginning of our class, we have to have that super. Otherwise, it is not going to work properly, and that will allow us to create the prototype chain in the correct order, and it'll work just fine. Other thing is basically everything related to the code we're going to talk about from now on is pretty much, other than at the very, very end, is in that constructor. Everything we're going to do is going to be in the constructor of the class. And then after that, we need to actually append that and register it with our custom element registry, and we do that by using custom elements define app blink. Now notice how it's got the app blink at the bottom, and I couldn't just call it blink. All of the custom tags in order to Word have to have a dash in there. because it kind of differentiates them from more normal HTML elements that are generally out there. So you're going to have to put a dash in there somewhere. You can have 3 or 4 of them if you want a super long name for whatever reason, but you have to have at least one. So I was boring and just called it @blink. And then we just reference our actual class of blink. From there, what we're going to do is actually get to that shadow root. And so what we're going to do is go ahead and establish, we're going to attach a shadow, We're going to attach shadow, which allows us to go ahead and open that shadow DOM. And we're going to use the mode of open. There's 2 modes, open and closed. Open allows us to use .shadow root in the parent to go ahead and access the shadow DOM and get some information about it. Closed would return that as null. So if you're creating a component for, maybe that's going to be used by a client, like in an outside source, and you really don't want them fiddling with it in any way, shape, or form, you might want it closed in order to lock it down. There's no reason for us to do that right now, so I just left it open. What we're going to do would work either way, but worth knowing that there's a differentiation between the two. So the first thing we're going to do is in our HTML, we're just going to say @blink. That's what we called our tag, right? And I'm going to add an attribute of text, and then we're going to take that text, put it inside of our component, and go ahead and make that blink. So in our JS, what that looks like is I'm going to create a wrapper so that I can easily attach all of my stuff inside of my component to go ahead and display. Since I'm just displaying text, I'm going to use a span because it's an inline component. It'll go put itself wherever it's supposed to. And then I'm going to get that attribute of text, and I'm going to go ahead and put it as the content inside of my span, inside of our wrapper, and go ahead and append that all to my wrapper. It's good. It's there. We're in good shape. So now our HTML, if we look at the output inside of our developer tools, just shows a span of hello world. We're good. And does a whole lot of nothing yet because we still need to make it blink. So that's when we get into the CSS side of things. So the next thing we're going to do is go ahead and add some CSS to it. So we're going to go ahead and add a class of blink, because, super original, right? We're still dealing with the blink tag. And we're going to go ahead and define that style. And document create element style. And inside of that style, I'm going to put some CSS, basically standard little keyframe that makes it blink forever and ever, hence the infinite. And the animation's going to loop every minute, every second. It's going to go ahead and blink. And I'm going to append that style to my element, which now we have a nice little blinky tag. And our output shows hello world, and we can blink, and has that class that we just added. However, the downside to this is how many of you actually like having that CSS right there inside of your JavaScript? Yeah, me neither. So let's go ahead and pull that out and put it inside of a CSS file where it belongs, right? Since we all seem to agree on that one. Let's go ahead and put it where I can actually, for sure say it, it's where it belongs. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to actually still create that style element, because we still need to somehow define that it's going to have a style. But instead of actually injecting all of that CSS in there, we're just going to use a CSS import, give it the file name that we're going to put right there in the same folder as our HTML and JavaScript. And there we go, and we're going to append that instead of our big chunk of JavaScript. And now our CSS is neatly tucked away in a CSS file where it belongs instead of inside of our JavaScript file. Now there's a little bit of a thing with this one. Once you do and start bundling it in order to make it into a package, in order to put it on the NPM registry, those paths can be a little funky, and so you may need to build you may need to do some build stuff around it in order to get because those paths will fail as soon as you try to bundle it. So worth noting, but in terms of development, it's a pretty easy script to go ahead and fix those at runtime. In terms of development, this is a lot easier to contend with and a lot more maintainable. So we still have the exact same thing we had before, and it's great. We have a blink tag, it's awesome, but it's just text. We want to blink more than just text, right? If we remember the original blink text, we could blink the entire page if we wanted to, right? So let's figure out how to do that. So that's where slots come into play. So I mentioned slots a little bit earlier. What those are going to allow us to do is actually take some markup that's in our parent component, shove it into our blink tag, and allow us to blink our entire page, potentially. This is not the one I had open. This one is. Okay. So in order to do that, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and make a slot. So slots are named, and that's because potentially you could have multiple slots. We're only going to have one, but think about maybe a card component where you might have a title, a body, and a footer, right? You may want multiple slots, so that's why they're going to be named, and anywhere in the code they're always going to be referenced by their name. So in our case, I'm going to just call it blink content. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create that slot. We're going to set the attribute of name, blink content, and append into our wrapper. Append order does matter. So when you are appending stuff to it, especially if you say have a title, a body, and a footer, like we just talked about for the card, if you do those in the wrong order, if you do the footer first, for example, it will append your footer first, and it'll be the first thing on your list. So make sure when you're keeping track of your appends that the order in which you put them on there is going to matter. Simply in just the way the display HTML order on the screen, unless you're doing some funky something like a display absolute in CSS or something. If you're just following the natural order of the HTML, it's just going to go in the order in which you append your stuff. And then in our HTML, what we're going to do is we're going to create a div inside of which I'm going to put that attribute of slot. That's how my component is going to know, hey, this is the content I need to take and put inside of my blink tag, and go ahead and put my content. Then in there, I was boring. I put a paragraph tag, but you could put the entire page. You could put lists, URLs, whatever, links. Pick your poison. Unicorns, rainbows. Whatever fancy you. So from there, we still exactly have the same thing we had before. The difference is now it's taking that paragraph tag that we have inside of our slot and putting that in instead of putting that attribute that we were using before. The really cool thing about this is one of the few ways that you can actually interact with what's inside your component, because as we talked about there being isolation there, right? So let's kind of look at where we can and cannot fiddle with things. So that's our paragraph tag, yay. So we're actually going to style that paragraph tag. The style.css, anytime you see that, we're talking about the application CSS versus anytime you see blink.css, that's when we're talking about the actual component CSS. That's going to matter because based on where you put what, that's going to affect whether only what's in the component gets affected or only what's in your application gets affected, and there's no translation and no cross-contamination between the two. They're completely isolated from themselves. I also use the variable notation because it makes it easier to play with stuff for our colors. So what I'm going to say is in my app.css, I'm going to tell it, hey, I want it to be underlined and of my primary color, which happens to be a blue-green. Normally, if you were to do that and we had used the attribute tag, those styles would not have shown up because at that point, it would have been trying to affect something inside of the component. Instead of this, the paragraph is still considered to be inside the parent. Because if you remember, that slot is actually being defined inside of the parent, not in our JavaScript where we created our component. So that's where the really cool part comes along. So anything you shove in there can now be styled from the parent. So that allows a lot of flex. It allows you as a developer to say, these are things I want my users to be able to fiddle with, and I want you to be able to shove whatever content you want here. Or this one, no, I really want this to just be a string. Only give me a string because I want it specified a specific way. Or only give me X type of content because I'm going to take it and do whatever with it in order to display it. So that allows some really nice stuff in there. So now, let's look at how we can even take that a step further and add a button to it. Because you know, accessibility matters, and we don't want to blink at people constantly. It's cute for about 2 seconds, and then it gets old, right? So let's allow people to start and stop the stuff. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a button that allows you to make it start blinking and make it stop already because, okay, the joke's over. So first thing we're going to do is go ahead and say, hey, I'm going to start it on false, because I want people to be able to play with it, but I don't want to shove it in their face. So I'm going to make it start on false. They can make it start whenever they want. I'm going to create a button. So just document.createElement button. I'm going to give it a type button, obviously. And I'm going to have an inner text of start blink So we're going to be able to toggle that later in order to make it change the text for it to stop blinking. And we're going to go ahead and append all of that to our button, because a whole lot of append all the places. Again, append matters, so I want my button to be underneath my blinky stuff, so I'm going to put it at this last thing I append. I generally keep my styles somewhere at the bottom somewhere, because that one doesn't really matter when it gets appended, unlike the rest. But if we wanted it to appear before our blink content, then we would have to put it on the top, right? We would have to be the first thing we do. So since our slot is appended first and our button is appended second, we're going to have our blink content first and our button second. So then we're going to do a little bit of blink logic, pretty standard JavaScript there, where we're just going to say, hey, if blink is true, go ahead and stop it. If blink is false, go ahead and start it, and switch the text accordingly so that users know what's going to happen with the button, and do an on-click. So we still have our nice little button, and we can press it, and we can click it, and it's perfectly fine. Now what happens if I create a button outside, and we styled it. I didn't show the CSS because that's kind of not the point, but we styled it to kind of match. What happens if I take a button outside of my component and I give it a completely different style? I want my buttons in the rest of my application to be for the font to be in cursive for whatever reason. Completely unreadable, but we'll do it anyway because it's a nice way to show it. What happens there is, because that is styles that are in the parent application and not inside of our component, it is only going to affect things outside of our component, not inside. So which means that me as a developer offering a UI library, say part of the marketing team has told me I want to make sure that all of our component looks like X, make sure that nothing gets fiddled with, I can say, sure, you can do whatever you want in your app, but the components that we're providing to you are always going to look like X no matter what you do outside of it. So that's kind of cool, because now you see the cursive is only affecting buttons that are in the application proper, not our component itself. So any kind of styling you would do would also get affected. And as you can see, the styles that are affected on the button that are inside of our component do not bleed into our parent application either. There's complete isolation between the two. There is one way you can affect the styles inside of the parent component, inside of that component. Now that I've said you can't, now I'm going to show you how you can do it anyway. The way you can do that is at the top of that custom element, that shadow host, there is a CSS property that will allow you to affect that. And what that does is the host is the equivalent of, say, in your HTML component, you've got your body, or you can set styles on HTML or on body. Think of it, the host, as kind of the same thing. It's kind of the HTML tag or the body for your component. And so what you can do is not only can you set styles to it, which means that anything inside of that component will have those styles, but it also means that you can take host context and go ahead and take that. So if we were to add a class to our custom component, host context allows me to go and check for said class, and if that class is true, then we can go ahead and apply different styling, for example. So if you were to theme something like have a dark theme and a light theme, or have maybe primary versus accent colors, or whatever the case might be, you can go ahead and have you can go ahead and add class names to those to your custom components, and have the CSS inside of that component check, does my host have this class, and then change the styling accordingly. So in this case, I'm using host context of dark. It's looking for, does my custom component have a class of dark? In our HTML, I went ahead and put a class of dark, so yes, it does. In which case, for the button, I want to make sure that I have a different background color and a different font color. And so that allows me to have two versions for our button, even though we only have one component, because I can style them differently depending on if I'm a light theme or dark theme. So that is one of the very few ways that you can actually affect your CSS inside of the component. Have you guys ever seen these? I'll give you a hint. Don't use them. So deep, deep, and deep, which are or the three arrows, which are shortcut for deep, these still will work in most Angular versions, which is where it gets confusing. That's because if you're not fiddling with it Angular by default is a emulated Shadow DOM. It's not actually using Shadow DOM. Browsers have deprecated and killed, depending on the browser, support for this. So even if it works today in the particular browser that you're testing for, not Chrome, it won't work in Chrome. I haven't checked Firefox in a while. It will quit working in the very, very near future if it hasn't stopped working today already. These allowed you to say, yeah, about that encapsulation, never mind, I'm going to go and change the styles inside of that component anyway. And that's creating problems because now you have this entire ecosystem of, I have components. They're completely isolated. I provide a component library. People can't fiddle with it. It'll be great. And developers are like, ha ha, yes I can. So those are actually, they were implemented for a while in some browsers, but they are being deprecated. You will still see it work in some of the libraries because they've either built in support for it or they're using emulated encapsulation, and that's why it still works. But yeah, and when you're dealing with native JavaScript components, that is a truly bad idea if it works at all. For the most part, it won't work. So yeah, don't use those. Probably shouldn't be using them in the other components either, and when you're using a framework either, but that's neither here nor there. So what about IDs? We've already established classes are isolated. What about IDs? Because IDs can be fun, right? Because first off, if you have the same ID multiple times, that's already a bad idea, right? Because that's not validating HTML to start with. So on top of that, you get some functionality funness if you have the same ID and you're on multiple elements and you're calling it and then gross happens. But this is a component. We may want to have 7 or 8 of them on the same page, right? Probably don't want to blink 7 or 8 things, but use case, right? But it might happen. So let's go ahead and add some IDs to things and see what happens in terms of that interaction. So I'm going to set, inside of the button on my HTML, I'm going to set an ID of button. And I'm also going to set an ID of button inside of my blink component. So they both have the same ID, right? On both sides of the fence. So we're going to see what happens. So both on the HTML, inside of the component, and on the one in our application. And on both cases, I'm going to say, hey, this is one of the few times where I'm not inside of the constructor because I'm saying that button that's in my application, I want you, when you get clicked, because our other one already handles the button, or is already handling our blink on, blink off, right? The one in my application, instead of handling blink on, blink off, what I want you to do is I want you to throw a hello world instead. It already doesn't do the blink on, blink off, so I'm guessing you guys already figured out that it's not going to translate, but for purposes. So now we have inside of our application, we're saying ID of button, I want you to throw a hello world alert. Inside of our component, I want you to go ahead and start and stop the blink. Guess which one is going to throw the hello world? Anybody? The one in the application. The other one will not throw it because it's completely isolated between the two. So that's the really cool bit. So not only are they completely insulated from a styling perspective, they're also completely insulated from a functionality perspective, which means you don't have to worry about having IDs. You can name your things like classes that make sense and IDs that make sense without a bunch of extra numbers and stuff, because there's no problem with repeated IDs because it's completely insulated. It's completely independent from what's going on outside of it. And again, with your classes, so any of you use Bootstrap at all at some point in your career? How many of you tried to do a class container and then realize for CSS and realize that, oh, wait, Bootstrap already hijacked that name. And so now we have to come up with ridiculous other names when we could have just been using container, right? So those are the things that having that complete isolation prevents. It means that you can still have completely semantic naming that makes complete sense inside of your components and inside of your app and not having to worry about the interaction between the two. And that all just basically out of the box without having to do CSS modules or CSS weird or anything in terms of the build or anything, because it's already right there canned and out of the box. So that's one of the features that I find particularly interesting with using those. So packaging it up, because it's all fun and games to have components, but I need to be able to ship it off to teams, right, to be able to use in Vue, React, Angular, or whatever. So let's look at how that works. Pretty simple. I'm going to use the a little bit newer, but the whole concept of JavaScript modules right there in ES6. I'm going to go ahead and take my blink tag, and I'm going to go ahead. I kind of shortened it for ease of readability, but you've got your class where you've defined your component. We've got our element, and then we're just going to export it. And so now we can have access to it. Create a nice little module that has, I also went ahead and reinstated the marquee tag, because if you're going to do blink, you have to do marquee, right? I mean, it's kind of sad if it's just blink. So you can go ahead and put those together, have your export. The advantage of doing it this way is that because I have them both independently set up with exports and then have like kind of a barrel set up with all of them, I can choose to either import them one by one in my application, or I can just import the entire barrel and have access to all of them. So that's kind of cool if you have a lot of components and you're worried about like the weight of just, so that your users can just choose, hey, I really just need this one component. It's a lot more helpful if they're using the full library. Being able to just import the barrel is a lot easier. So it gives a little bit of flexibility that way. So from there, just basically take that whole entire file, go and basically npm ship that stuff, put it up on a repo, and see what happens. Super simple. I can import it. This one is a local import of the vanilla retro. That was our barrel. I'm just importing blink and marquee. It just works. I put it in, and poof, on my page, we have a beautiful blink tag. It just works. The one that I have in the published library is simply the normal blink. It doesn't have all of the button and the fun stuff in it. It's just a normal blink tag. But it just works simple. This is if you were doing just a static HTML page. A little bit of a warning if you do that. If you decide to try to play the import game, you will get this beautiful error from Chrome that says CORS hates you, because CORS always hates everybody. Because who likes having CORS errors? Yeah, they're fun. The way to get around that is if you're doing an import from a barrel, you need to go ahead and serve it up on HTTP or HTTPS. So I use HTTP server. It's super simple, but you need to have it actually served up. If you try to run it just locally as a normal file, you'll get a pretty CORS error, and it will basically tell you that no, it won't do it. So what about Angular? Because the point is, we've got vanilla. What about putting it in Angular? Well, we can. Just do a simple import my JS file. That's my nice little barrel. It's got all of my stuff. The thing is, that one's going to throw an error too, because all of a sudden it's not going to recognize that as a custom component, because it's not a component you built in Angular. So Angular doesn't know that that component exists. So you're going to have to tell your application that it's got a custom element schema. So if you just tell it that, it's going to ignore the fact that it doesn't recognize the component and move ahead. You can actually define a schema if you wanted to, like lock it down to specific component names. But if you just put that up, it'll go ahead and ignore the fact that it doesn't know what it is, that Angular itself doesn't know what it is, and go ahead and give you a nice little blink tag. And so inside of, and I actually called my library retro blink, because I tried to call it, tried several different names, and they were all taken, because, I mean, how easy is it to find a name on NPM that isn't taken yet? It took me longer to find a name than to actually write the library, just saying. But so it's called retro blink once it's packaged and inside the library on NPM. But it totally works in Angular. So what about Vue? Because, I mean, can't forget Vue. I also have React, don't worry. Same idea, we go ahead and import. Vue was even nicer. I didn't have to do anything with the schemas or anything. By doing the, Vue run, it's already being served up, so I didn't have any errors, no problems, and it just kind of worked. So what about React? Can you guys guess? Is it going to work? Yeah. React, same thing. Did just a normal import, retro blink, put my slot, and it just works as well. So that is how you go ahead and make vanilla components. I mean, you could try this with Mithril and all of the libraries under the sun. I don't know them all, but you get the idea. You import it, and you may or may not have to do a little bit in terms of making sure whatever framework of the day recognizes that component or not, depending on how picky the framework is. But you can go ahead and take it, import it, and it just works. So this is where the GitHub is where I have the code. The NPM is the actual package itself, if you guys want to pick that up. And the bit.ly at the bottom is where you can find this slide deck. Any questions? Because that is what I had for you guys. Yes? No, because the custom tag is actually the host. So if we go, let me go back to, where's my mouse? Where's the mouse? Hello? I want this one. Yes. So if we go back to this little diagram, the custom element itself, right up here, is what that custom element is. So in and of itself, it cannot also be the slot, if that makes sense. Because that's where in the, if you look at the DOM tree, that's where it's being opened. So it might work in some browsers, maybe. I'm not sure, but I would. It's not meant to, because that's where that's what's attaching the root, and it's also going to cause issues in terms of your CSS and your host context and stuff. It's a pretty bad idea in general. So no, you definitely want that sacrificial component, whether it's a div or otherwise, because as you may have, I don't know if I pointed it out, but that whatever that component you're setting as slot is really kind of ignored. It's you could technically put it on the template component essentially, because it's not translating into it at all. One other thing I forgot to mention about that, one of the few things that does pierce that is the aria. So if you have a button inside of a component, your accessibility tree will be able to read that. So that's cool. That's worth knowing. But if you're if you have an input field and you're doing a for to figure out where the label is, and those are in and out, then you won't. So make sure you know where those intricacies lies. But no, attaching it to the host would be a bad idea, because that's where your entry point into the shadow. Does that make sense? Anything else? Yes.
Yeah, I'm lucky enough to be working with I11.
Okay.
Is there anything you can use from this in I11? You can say no.
You would have to make sure that you have polyfills for every last little bit. There are polyfills out there. I have not played with them, but my assumption is that if you ran it through Babel, you might be able to get something working, but I have not tried it because I kind of... for this particular context, no, I didn't need to, and so it was not like... But I would assume that with the correct polyfills ran through Babel, you may have a shot at maybe. Yes.
I can answer that question with component polyfill. What you have to put in as well as part of it is compiling that down to the ones with JavaScript. You do a check, and then the web component polyfill that's available
So what he was saying is that there is actually a web component Java polyfill that you can use. So that's the answer. Anything else? Yes? Well, because it's just JavaScript. So at that point, any kind of testing framework or a testing system that you would use for standard JavaScript, you could use to test your component at that point. Because of the encapsulation, you might want to divvy out your unit testing to make sure that the code is organized so that your unit testing can test what's inside of the component. But no, it's just JavaScript, so any kind of framework or testing tool that you would use to test JavaScript would work. Yes?
So when you're using Angular and use the custom element, if we use the custom element schema, would it just like ignore all the text even though it's wrong?
Yes. And that's where you may, instead of, like I blanketly just allowed custom element schema, but you can actually define what schema that it would be allowed to and not allowed to use. It's somewhere in the documentation buried But at that point, if you're doing this in production, I just went wild wild west and let it just accept everything. But you can you would probably want to define a schema. It's the same way XML, right? You can set XML to define a schema or to be allowed anything. It's kind of the same idea. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, so they would bubble. Events would. The question was, if would events inside would events bubble because of the encapsulation, and the events would bubble within the encapsulation, but not out. So if you had like several layers and like maybe several, like several layers inside of the component, it would bubble all the way up to wherever it needed to inside of that component, but not out. So it would stop out, the bubbling would stop at wherever the component stops. So there's no interaction between what's inside and what's outside. Yeah, so you would have to have an attribute or a listener or something to communicate between the two. That's where you'd almost have to have something very similar to the prop system in React or event listeners and handlers inside of Angular. I haven't really played much with trying to do it with the components, but it's obviously like finding it's probably possible. I just haven't dug that deep. I need to, because you're the second person who's asked me that at this point. Yeah. Well, thank you guys.